Hey guys, welcome to Module 4. This week, the focus of our discussion board assignment and our short paper is on the role of citizen participation in local government. In your discussion, you'll be looking at public participation and potential benefits to the municipality. And in our short paper, you'll be evaluating public participation in the context of whether it's helpful or harmful to a municipal government. And for the short paper, you'll be using the research article posted in Brightspace by Yang and Callahan, titled Citizens' Involvement Efforts in Bureaucratic Responsiveness, Participatory Value, Stakeholder Pressures, and Administrative Practicality. And so that's going to be the key reading that you have to do this week in order to offer a proper response to our short paper topic this week. And in essence, you're going to be looking at public participation and how it might do more harm than help in addressing municipal issues. And then you have to state your opinion as to whether or not you think this level of participation helps local government or does not help local government. So that's the essence of the short paper. And again, this research article is going to be important. Now, as you read through the research article, there is a lot of technical stuff under the heading of methodology. But I think you could just glimpse over that, casually look it over if you want. But I think that the primary areas that we need to pay attention to are the introduction, which is going to help identify the problem and for you to understand what the problem is, the results, and I think a key to understanding the results is going to be looking at the tables that the authors provide. The discussion component is going to be really key because the discussion is going to lay out the results in such a way that you can understand their applicability to the topic of citizen participation. And then the conclusion will be important as well, okay? And the level of participation that they're going to be talking about is really going to be focusing on the level of citizen involvement when it comes to decision-making, all right, or public policy. In other words, the role that citizens should have as volunteers in the policy-making process that takes place within a city. And so I'm gonna touch on this a little bit more during this lecture. But first, I'm just going to touch on a couple things that I think are going to be important for us to understand this week. Okay. So the first thing we're going to look at is benefits to volunteerism, and there's an array of benefits. You have an infusion of talent and expertise. In other words, you have volunteers that have a very practical skill set that can be useful to any public entity. Financial savings, you have volunteers doing what you might have to pay somebody else to do. Increases government legitimacy, efficiency, and accountability. I think the more open government is in terms of its volunteerism, the more people you have that can offer a positive overview of government and governmental operations. So volunteerism, I think, actually helps government in terms of its legitimacy, efficiency, and accountability. And then we could look at volunteerism as a tradition in the United States. So what I mean by that is in early communities, we're talking about the 16th, 17th, and maybe even to the 1800s, volunteerism was key. A lot of services were conducted voluntarily. Public safety is a good example. I mean, initially, public safety in terms of whatever law enforcement was in existence at the time was strictly volunteer, as well as the firefighting efforts. So historically speaking, the U.S. has a history of volunteerism. Now, the distinction that we're going to make here in a few minutes is that we have volunteer programs, and then we have public participation in areas that might affect public policy. And so those areas that might affect public policy might be things such like maybe you have a planning commission, all right, something along those lines, or some level of citizen review board that sits primarily as a volunteer basis to assist the government, the local government, in some of the policy making. In other words, they have some say and maybe even some influence in local government policy making. And so those are the two distinctions that we need to talk about. I think your discussion board assignment this week is really going to be focusing on the initial level of volunteerism that you and I might be familiar with. In other words, you might have volunteers in Neighborhood Watch. You might have volunteers that work at the library and help refile books or help the public that might not be as astute in computers. So you have volunteers to do that. So there's an array of volunteerism that occurs in every local government. And so as you think about this on your discussion board assignment this week, feel free to reference those specific volunteer programs in your local municipality, whatever that might be. Because I think that'll add something to the overall discussion in terms of our discussion board. So now I just want to focus a little bit more on the second half, which is going to be primarily the essay function, and that is public participation in the level of policy decision making and whether or not it's helpful or harmful. So first thing we have to look at really is how we're going to look at and define this idea of citizen involvement. Now, the authors of the research article pretty much identified as activities initiated by government to encourage citizen participation in administrative decision-making and managerial processes, okay? So again, we're looking at it from the context of not somebody that volunteers to help at the library in terms of filing books or helping somebody on the computer, but we're talking about citizen participation in administrative decision-making, such as does this proposed development fit the land use as set out by city code? And that might be something for one's planning commission, okay? So planning commissions are clearly involved in some administrative decision making when people want to do some development within the jurisdiction of that specific municipality. Bureaucratic realities require managers to consider the practicality of citizen involvement in terms of resources required, in other words, any training or special needs, institutional capacity needed, do we need more equipment, do we need more room, what is needed if we're going to engage in the practicality of more citizen involvement in terms of this administrative decision-making process. And then look at potential barriers. What are the barriers that might exist, both from the public perspective, in other words, why might not somebody participate, to the other side is what barriers might city administrators put up because they don't want to lose some of their power or administrative authority when dealing with the public or citizens as part of this administrative decision-making process. So barriers have been attributed to both citizens and administrators, and this is going over some highlights from that research article. In some areas, you could argue that citizens lack competence. In other words, they don't understand what's required of them in serving and in some level of a decision-making capacity. And so they lack competence, they lack expertise, they lack the necessary skill, maybe interest, perhaps even time for meaningful participations. Those who might participate might also promote their own agenda, all right? So they may have a particular agenda in mind for joining a particular decision-making administrative role within local government. So those are some of the barriers related to citizens. Public administrators are often criticized for promoting their own agendas as well as their unwillingness to share power. So what we're talking about here is whether or not public administrators use some of these citizen groups that are going to be involved at some level of the decision-making process, whether or not they view them as merely rubber stamps. In other words, I'm the administrator for the planning department, and I'm going to tell you that this development here does not meet our city standards, and therefore you should vote against this proposal. But again, they also are unwilling to share their power. All right, so you know, there is power associated with different positions within the city, obviously, and obviously, if you have to share that power with citizens, then your power might be somewhat diminished, or you may perceive it to be somewhat diminished. Lack of time and financial resources necessary for meaningful citizen involvement to take place. So that could be a lack of time, not only of the citizen, but it could be lack of time for the specific administrator. And of course, financial issues can always be a problem depending on the scope of the citizen involvement and the tools that they need in order to make effective decisions as part of their role in participating in local government. Authentic participation is needed to improve trust. So participation is a critical point in terms of local government using it as a means to improve trust. In other words, the more people know something about local government, the less suspicious they are of local government. And for example, one avenue that police departments often take is they might have a citizens academy where ours lasted like 8 weeks, where every week the public experiences a new element of the police department and understands what their role and responsibilities are. That is in part designed to not only educate the public, but it's also designed to foster and improve trust. So now you have somebody who's somewhat educated as terms of how and why police do certain things. And so they can be a means to help further build trust within the community. Government might be constrained by lack of resources, but citizen involvement can be used to build partnerships in order to address resource problems. So use of citizen groups to purchase specific equipment, for example. So, you know, a lot of law enforcement agencies, if they have a canine program, oftentimes the canines are donated by a citizen group, whether it be a local civic group such as Rotary or Kiwanis or whatever. Local government at times is going to be constrained, and so it's going to be important for citizens' involvement as that partnership. They can offer some help in addressing the resource problems that may occur within local government. Now, the research article goes in and talks about different stakeholders and the pressures that those stakeholders have in terms of public participation in the decision-making process, or in that administrative decision-making process that takes place. And those stakeholders are elected officials, nonprofits, media, business, religious organizations, political parties, and citizens. You're going to get a lot of pressure from elected officials, because elected officials are key in the role that citizens play in local government. If they want more citizens involved in some of the administrative decision-making processes, they will go ahead and instruct, in this case, the city manager, to create a board, a library board, for example. We want to create a library board to allow citizens to have more say in terms of operational needs of the library and so forth. Nonprofits, an array of nonprofits could be Salvation Army, could be some other type of nonprofit that exists in your community that offers some service. Maybe it's through a religious organization that provides services for homeless, things like that. The use of the media, business partners, political parties, not so much, because a lot of local government in operational sense is nonpartisan. And then citizens can be stakeholders in terms of the overall operation of the city, in terms of the level of volunteerism and the extent to which those citizens are going to be participants in the overall administrative decision-making process that takes place within local government. Okay, now I'm going to talk about the results of Yang and Callahan's study, but I'm going to end it here and we're going to go to part 2. Thanks, guys.